Before we get started, a quick thank you to our members on Patreon. You know, local media is taking hits all over the country, including Detroit. And it's our members on Patreon, patreon.com/dailydetroit, who help keep us fast and fearless. So join us, patreon.com/dailydetroit. We appreciate you. And now on to the show. Hello, everyone, and welcome to your Daily Detroit, recording at our studio in Tech Town. It is Thursday, October 17th, 2024. I am J.R. Stays, and across the table from me is none other than the illustrious Norris Howard. How are you?
I'm feeling great, man. It's been a very busy week here in the city of Detroit. We're going to get into it, though.
Yeah, I feel like, I really tried to keep all of the political stuff to Steve Freese once a week, because that's by request of listeners. But let's be honest, we're not able to do that because it's just jumping off where I feel like we probably have to touch us a couple of times a week. Also, you bring a different perspective than Steve, shall we say? But before we get into that, we're going to do something fun.
Okay.
Completely unimportant.
Yeah. I wouldn't say unimportant, but different.
If you look in front of you, do you see a glass with liquid? How would you describe this liquid?
A sort of radioactive color, a radioactive green, not quite Mountain Dew green, but Jolly Rancher green.
I feel like this cup contains, as if you were to have melted Slimer as an army man on the barbecue.
Yeah, carbonated lizard spit.
In all seriousness, we are trying the Faygo green apple flavor. This is brand new out of Faygo. They sent it to the studio unsolicited. Quite nice little care package here.
That does include actual green apples.
Yes, actual green apples for comparison. We're going to do a little tasting.
Yeah, let's do it.
A little thing here. A lot of nose. There's a lot of apple nose.
Yeah. Melted Jolly Rancher. Melted green Jolly Rancher. A lot of sugar.
If you're into that.
Yeah, that's your jam, but this is a lot.
Yeah, this is a sweet.
Oh, wow.
Green apple nectar.
It's so green.
It's very green.
Like, that's the taste. What does it taste like? Green.
That is the test if you're from Detroit. Do you refer to flavors in colors or in fruit?
No, colors. Does it taste red? That's why it's called red pop.
So, for the uninitiated, what would you consider red as a taste?
Strawberry-ish. Not strawberry, but strawberry-ish. So red pop tastes red.
And raspberries that are red are actually blue.
Yes.
In this world.
Yes, that's correct.
It's blue raspberry. Mm-hmm. It's not red raspberry ever.
No, it's blue raspberry.
And of course, there's purple drink.
There is purple drink, which sugar, water, and of course, purple.
Now, did you ever drink the little hugs? Was that you, like the little barrels?
Heck yeah.
Same.
Come on, nah, I spend way too much time on the east side to not drink them.
My dad used to try and tell me that Faygo orange was orange juice.
Did you have teeth problems as a child? Because I feel like maybe you did.
You know what? If you're into that green apple flavor, they hit it. I'm a big fan of reviewing things for what they are. And they hit it. They hit exactly what's on the tin. And if you are into green apple, and I am. I mean, look, I don't turn down a green apple Jolly Rancher here and there.
Yeah, but it is very sweet. Very sweet.
You know what? Vodka.
Maybe.
Or gin. Or some sort of, where
More
it's
gin.
like, this is the mixer.
Yeah. Or if you want to go full kidney stones, you could do rum.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, I realize now with the apple.
Yeah, rum. Malibu and green apple Faygo. The Jolly Roger. I might need to try it.
All right, let's get into some of the more serious news. As I said, politics are kind of taking over things right now because streets downtown are blocked. The stories are so much about things because both sides of the political aisle are in Detroit like crazy, regardless, it seems, of their feelings about Detroit. They are all over this city. You've got Vice President Kamala Harris, who is doing an interview with Charlamagne the God and a bunch of other appearances. Donald Trump is going to be here again on Friday. The vice presidential candidates are running around, and it seems like all of the conversation is kind of coming to a crescendo in these final couple weeks plus of the election.
Yeah, it's really interesting because, as we know, this is kind of riding on the coattails of not just 2020, which Detroit was sort of I don't want to call it ground zero, but it was definitely a city in which the election narrative was playing out. The sort of electors were choosing or not choosing to ratify votes. You had people intimidating poll workers.
All the stuff at the convention center.
Everything that was happening. Kind of Detroit was, it was all happening in Detroit. So you got that then followed up by the midterms, in which the Democrats had massive victories.
Outperformed the polls. The litmus test for a post-Roe, world played out in Michigan. It is one of the purplest states in the union, battleground state if there ever has been one, alongside Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. Detroit is becoming the field for which these two sides are wanting to wage war, and here we are. Well, since the last time we hit the air, there was a statement out by the United Auto Workers, because apparently at the Chicago Economic Club, Trump said that auto work is simple.
Yeah, that children could do it. He compare cars like to Legos.
So
basically.
Why is he coming back here on Friday?
Because, I think his campaign said, dude, you have to go back.
But I will say this, after the second time he crapped on Detroit, I got a wave of, especially, it seemed to be older listeners, or maybe older drive-by listeners, who were like, you shouldn't stand up for Detroit. It's lost. This whole thing. And it's like, I'm sure you're not a regular listener of this show, because if you are that person to have that opinion, I don't feel like you'd be listening to this show for very long.
Well, not even just that, but if Detroit was lost, it wouldn't have just had its first wave of population growth in the past 25 years. You wouldn't see the level of investment that's going into the city of Detroit. You wouldn't have seen the sports teams returning to the city of Detroit. No, I just want to address this because what you just said is a logical fallacy. It's one thing to say that 15 years ago.
They just don't want black people to do well.
You just don't want a majority black city to be doing good. Just say it with your chest. Just be, I would rather you be honest and just say there are too many black folks in Detroit and I don't like it. That's what I want you to say. I don't want to see it. I don't want to deal with it. And going down there pisses me off. That's what you should say. But on a more serious tip, even though Donald Trump may hate this place, may not like this place, may think it's a whole cesspool, whatever you want to say, he has to put respect on its name. Because he has to come back here, because if he loses Michigan, he will lose the election. Just like if he loses Georgia, he will lose the election. Or if he loses Pennsylvania, he will lose the election. So it's simple mathematics. It has nothing to do with if you personally like Detroit or not. The math got a math.
Most recently to recording this, Harris has been in town doing media hits and other kinds of outreach events, and notably did an audio town hall with Charlamagne the God, of which actually some of the people who asked questions, I actually, you and I both personally know. And it was interesting to see that Charlamagne was the vehicle in Detroit when Charlamagne's not based in Detroit. Like, it's something for me that kind of hits a little bit differently than past years, and that it's a national voice talking about these issues, as opposed to, I think in previous times, there's been more of the local voices involved.
I mean, but at the same time, who here, and I don't mean this to denigrate on our colleagues, but who here has the chops to do that? Because that was a nationally syndicated interview. It wasn't just an interview that aired in Detroit.
Right. It was set in Detroit, but it was set in Detroit, recorded in Detroit, but Charlamagne's not a Detroiter.
No, but it was a nationally syndicated interview. And so iHeartRadio, who put on the interview, put their nationally syndicated voice behind it. So that makes sense to me. But what I mean by who has the chops is that I feel like if we were talking about 10, 15, maybe even really 20 years ago, really I'm talking about 20 to 25 years ago, I think that aspect of the question becomes a lot more viable, because the media landscape was a lot different in Detroit back then. It was a lot more robust. That's the word I'm looking for.
I remember those days. It's interesting to hear the retirement of Devin Scillian, who I very much respect, and actually I worked with a number of years ago. I'm sure he does not remember me in that context. But I also think that how people consume media has changed a bit. Here's my point. I wonder if the calculation is that people who watch local news have already made their decision?
I think people who listen to, public radio have already made their decision. People who are listening to talk radio have already made their decision. These demos have already been hit, and they've been hit over and over and over again. The gap, especially in the city of Detroit and other metro areas around the country, is in urban radio. That's the gap. Because traditionally, that community does not get spoken to until around this time, but they don't get spoken to at the time in which this aired, right? This interview was on air at peak drive time. I think it was 5 p.m. Eastern. So you're talking about peak drive time for the East Coast. So you hit drive time New York, drive time Atlanta, drive time DC, all these areas, Baltimore, Philly, all these areas with these massive, right? But you're talking about massive African-American populations that normally would only get this kind of interview first thing in the morning during Charlamagne's show. But now this was put in which people are in their cars, they're driving home from work, and they're listening to a presidential candidate talk about issues specific, or at least her plan that was specific for the African-American community. I think that was a powerful move, and I think she hit the people that she needed to hit in terms of the demos. Bringing in a local news host, that's not going to have the same effect. Charlamagne is known nationwide, and therefore that's probably who should have done it.
What did you think of the content?
I personally thought, obviously as somebody who's plugged in, there wasn't a lot new for me. But I think as we explore and listen to the people who are not as keyed in and not as clued in, I think they got a lot of value out of this, because Charlamagne asks questions very pointedly. And sometimes he's incorrect, or sometimes you may not like the questions he asks.
Well, and they had people on there that have had a little bit of controversy around them. Like one of the questions was asked by I Swear Vezzo.
Yeah, but you know what? I respect that, because I Swear Vezzo is somebody who is known in the city. I've sat in think tanks, in panels and stuff with I Swear Vezzo and asked him directly, like, dude, why did you go to that Trump thing? And his answer to me was because he reached out to me personally. The Democratic Party did not reach out to me. And on top of that, he said, the rhetoric around people talking about Trump as a felon offended me. He said, I'm a felon. There are people I know who are felons. They're not felons anymore. They have corrected their lives and put themselves on the straight and narrow. But because I'm a felon, that makes me somehow less valuable to reach out to. I'm a person. And, you can reject or be angry at that all you want. But specifically in certain communities, that is a thing that people should think about when it comes to their rhetoric. And so I didn't find any offense to having, New Era Detroit or I Swear Vezzo or any of those folks ask those questions, because they are still representatives of aspects of the African-American community, and therefore their voices are just as valid as everybody else's.
I think this is a conversation that goes beyond city borders too. People forget that there's a very large minority population, very large not white population in Metro Detroit.
I mean, at this point, we got to stop calling them minorities, because in large areas of the country, they are not the minority. It is a national conversation, and it is a good platform for Kamala Harris to get out specifically this agenda for Black men and talk about some of the issues that, at least in her purview, are important for her to address for the African-American community. And so I think for her to be able to face Black voters directly was, I don't want to say courageous, but I think it was something that was needed, especially given this sort of truncated campaign cycle that she's had.
Well, let's talk about that, what she calls the opportunity agenda for Black men. It is a 9-page document, lots of text, lots of things in it. We're not going to go through it point by point. I know that you're somewhat familiar with it. I've read through it, but I really want to get your opinions, because mine are not that valid in this whole situation. My thing is, and this is what I hear from some folks in some corners, and I bristle at this a little bit, where it's like, well, why are you specifically calling out an agenda for one group and not another? I've heard this so many times in mainstream.
Shut up, because you're just saying that because they haven't addressed you specifically. Here's why. Is because African Americans, even though Latinos are very quickly catching up to being the second largest demographic in America, the African American demographic controls more states. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the South, how African American people vote is generally how certain states may go. You're starting to see that in Georgia. You're starting to see that in Pennsylvania. You're starting to see that in Michigan, in which this very, very powerful voting bloc can control the destinies of national elections. Going to that, and not to mention, let's just be very honest, we're a loud bunch. And I don't mean that from a stereotypical point of view. I mean that to say our hold on culture and what becomes cool, what becomes known, what becomes the zeitgeist, in a lot of ways, must either be birthed in or come through the African-American community. I think to deny that is to deny how popular culture works in general. And so her calculus is that if I address these issues of the African-American community and the Black community, I can erode some of the losses that I may have had elsewhere. Particularly if you talk about Metro Detroit, you're talking about potentially the Arab Muslim vote, where she's going to lose some of those people, period. Some of those people will
We don't know how many.
We don't know how many, but she's going to lose some of those voters. If she can make up the difference with African-American men, that will be okay for her.
So there are 5 major parts in this. The first one is 1 million loans that are forgivable to Black entrepreneurs and others to start a business. Thoughts on that?
I think it's great. As she said in the interview, only 1% of venture capital in this country goes to African-American businesses.
Far underpacing.
I fact checked that. That's true. And it far underpaces everything else.
It's one of the reasons why here at Tech Town, it's actually somewhat remarkable, some of the things that they do. If you look at the big board, it is, African-American and woman entrepreneurs that are mostly served here. And that is very unusual in the business community.
It is. And, really what it should do is it should shame the business community, and it should make them feel like fools that 12 to 15% of the population only gets 1% of the investment. Yeah, you should feel stupid.
I also think that this is a function, not to excuse it, but I feel like oftentimes money follows connections.
Absolutely.
And I think that there's a statistic, and I do not have the fact check on it because it's been a few years and it was at a conference. But it blew my mind in this way. If you look at, this is back when Facebook was like the big deal, right? For the average African-American Black person, you had 1 white friend for every 9 Black friends. Mm-hmm. For the average white person, they had 1 Black friend for every 90 friends.
Yep.
And I've wondered why people are like, hey, your Facebook feed's a little different. Mm-hmm. And it's like, because it, in my experience, I don't know about yours, I feel like that stat actually rings very true for most people.
I think it does, unless you either went to school in the city of Detroit or, decided to go to one of the state schools.
I have African-American family members.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's shifting around some of the metros in America, but I think for the most part that rings true. And money, connections, access, that all follows those through lines. And so I think as we talk about small businesses and loans and access to capital, this is a good start. Obviously, it does not address anything in terms of how bad the problem actually is, but it's a step in the right direction. And I think it's positive.
Number 2 is championing education, training, and mentorship programs that help Black men get good paying jobs in high demand industries and lead their communities, including pathways to become teachers.
Yeah, I think that's cool. I think it's obtuse. I think it's hard to really put that into systems. I've been the director of a after school and mentorship program. It's difficult. It's very difficult. It requires a lot of vetting. It requires a lot of research. It requires a lot of sacrifice on the part of the mentors. And so I think that one's a little bit obtuse and difficult, but I appreciate the idea.
Third, supporting a regulatory framework for cryptocurrency and other digital assets so Black men who invest in and own these assets are protected. I thought this was really interesting because it feels like there's a government turn where it used to be we're going to shut down all cryptocurrency. Now it's like, well, maybe not.
I feel like this was definitely like she's got a Black tech bro in her sphere, and like this was his jam. Like this was the thing he wanted in, because the vast majority of African American people do not own cryptocurrency, nor do they care about cryptocurrency. I would prefer,
you were just keeping it real.
Yeah, I would prefer if the energy for this was put towards saying, we want to eliminate the adoption of cashless stores and venues.
Speak more on that.
That would be a more realistic objective that I think particularly affects low-income African Americans, because as we move towards obviously being able to tap and credit cards and all that, if your credit score is low enough, you can't even open a bank account. So you're going to check cash in places, you're going to liquor stores, people are still cashing their checks that way, and you're operating a lot with cash. So if you don't have the ability to literally shop, then that's an issue. Now, obviously, your big box chains and stores are not doing that. But I think if something was codified to say there will always be a cash option everywhere.
Walmart will gladly cash your check.
Yes.
And then take your money.
And then
let you spend there.
Yeah, absolutely. But let's say you want to go out for a nice dinner and you go to one of these restaurants in town. We don't take cash. I actually think that should not be legal.
And it's not legal in the city of Detroit.
No, it's not.
Which is a different thing. And I've heard some entrepreneurs grouse that, security and, things like that. But at the end of the day,
But when the last time somebody robbed a restaurant? Come on, man.
This is going to sound super conservative of me, but I think money should have value, real money.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's fiat currency, so none of it's real.
You know what I mean.
The point is that we shouldn't be a cashless
You mean
society.
you don't have a whole bag of gold bars, Norris?
No, I certainly don't. But instead of this focus on cryptocurrency, which there's no effort really to me that I've seen nationally in order to make this a real thing, I just think that's a waste of energy.
Starting a national health equity initiative focused on Black men that addresses sickle cell disease, diabetes, mental health, prostate cancer, and other health challenges that disproportionately impact them.
Issue number one.
So number 4 should be number 1.
Number 4 should be number 1, because we know Black men die earlier than men of other demographics. There's lifestyle choices that go into that, but there's also health access that goes into that. I had a conversation, this is a personal anecdote, but I had a conversation with my father when I was about 18 years old. He told me, listen, he said, based on the averages, for every year you get of me being alive after 55 is a bonus. He said, so you should really appreciate it. And I'm like, Pops, that's really dark and morbid. He was like, go look it up. It's the truth. And at the time, he wasn't that far off. But because of it, and my father is a cancer survivor, and that's the thing, is he had great health care from his job. He was able to get the treatment that he needed. Most African-American men don't. And beyond the cultural things that we could talk about, they don't have the regular primary care physicians that they should have. They don't know what to look out for. And then some of them flat out are just caught up in their own sort of stuff, their own myths, the idea that they need to be working all the time and taking rest is actually frowned upon.
Rest is resistance.
Yeah, rest is resistance, and it is also productivity as well. This is huge for me. This is a big deal for me, and I really think that should have been way more touched on.
And finally, number 5, legalizing recreational marijuana and creating opportunities for Black Americans to succeed in this new industry. I will note right out here for newer listeners, this has actually been an ongoing topic that you and I have talked about on the show, because there have actually been a lot of hurdles to getting some of these businesses into the hands of Black ownership here, even with all the intentions to get Black people into the marijuana industry in Detroit. There have been so many legal barriers to that, especially through lawsuits and other things where they've had to really finagle and shift this whole thing to make it so that it's residents, and there's just a lot to it.
Yeah, there is. And listen, the city of Detroit tried its best to make it as equitable as possible, but that came under numerous legal challenges. And, I think if we're talking about a national or federal legalization movement, I think that's fine. I think weed is such a stupid thing for it to be illegal anyway. The biggest thing for me is that unless this comes with record expungement, it doesn't mean anything.
Some of that's on a state level, which I think Governor Whitmer has done some of that.
Yeah, if the national legalization comes then with each state saying, cool, it's legal now, we'll expunge that from your record, I think at that point we're good.
You also need to get marijuana businesses access to banking, though.
Yes.
Which doesn't happen right now.
Well, and through legalization, this is the only way it happens, because right now you have to pay cash. And if we're going to actually talk about businesses that do get robbed, it's because everybody knows that you have to have massive amounts of cash on hand to run a marijuana dispensary because you can't have access to banking. You can't get loans. You can't just go deposit a whole bunch of cash. So I think it's a step in the right direction. It's good. But the biggest thing for me is that it's got to come with record expungement as well.
Norris Howard, so good to talk to you. This is like a deep episode. I want to hear people's feedback. dailydetroit@gmail.com. I hope that you heard something in this and that you learned something in this, because I think you bring a lot of perspective to this.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm just happy that the city of Detroit is put once again into the national spotlight, and for nothing bad. That's the wild thing. When's the last time we've been in the national spotlight for just being Detroit? Not for being
a sports
bankrupt,
team.
Not for a sports team, not for crime, not for murder. No, we are in the news because we simply exist.
And if you hate Detroit and listen to this show regularly, please email me. Why are you here?
Yeah, why do you listen? That's curious.
You just hate us?
No,
I mean, you just personally have animus towards us? We're nice people.
I would love to hear from you and tell you how stupid you are, but I still want to hear from you.
Norris Howard's Haterade.
There you go.
All right, with that, I'm Jer Stave.
And I'm Norris Howard.
Thank you so much for listening. Remember to drop 5 stars on your favorite podcast app. We are supported by our members on Patreon, patreon.com/dailydetroit. Remember that you are somebody, and we'll see you around town.